Punk rock was born in the late 60s and early 70s, somehow almost simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic. First in the US and then in the UK, from where it really became one of the most significant musical genres, movements, and philosophies of the 20th century. By the late 70s, the bands that were on the forefront had been ravaged by drugs or had dissolved mostly due to growing ego trips clashing between its members. Punk rock had failed to fuel a social revolution like it was intended to do, and the piss-off attitude gave way to the diva-like behavior of the most iconic representatives of the movement. The Sex Pistols broke up in 1978, and punk rockers everywhere felt cheated and betrayed that the fight for social justice and equality, and the effort to shake society's fundaments had gone up in smoke. Many realized that it had been a naive dream and that it took much more to really make a change. Punk started evolving in two different paths. Post-punk, the first one, was open to influences that were never close to the philosophy of punk, experimentation for the sake of art, and taking music to levels of never-ending variety. The other one was exclusive, angry, and unforgiving. It was called hardcore. As much as punk rock had been naive in its attempts to bring down the establishment, thinking that they were mature enough to bring real change, hardcore punk was founded in reality. Punk rock had been swallowed by the establishment and became just another trend off which it made money. Hardcore, on the other hand, had put both middle fingers up, and was a conscious break away from the norm, severing all ties with mainstream and modern cultural values on purpose. It was and still is, the largest uncompromised underground movement in music history. It is an expression of people who accepted reality and decided to pay the price for not willing to blend in. Adamantly refusing to kiss ass, and dance to the tunes of the modern capitalist world or any trend. Hardcore has remained in the underground by choice, and it's a fact to be proud of. This project is my attempt to bring light to an art form that wants to be far from mainstream, a musical genre, and a philosophy of life that does not welcome outsiders with open arms. A movement that you have to prove yourself to be part of, and a musical form that I've loved for decades. The definition of hardcore as given by Wikipedia is that it is a punk rock music genre and subculture that originated in the late 1970s. It is generally faster, harder, and more aggressive than other forms of punk rock. Hardcore punk generally disavows commercialism, the established music industry, and anything similar to the characteristics of mainstream rock, and often addresses social and political topics with confrontational, politically charged lyrics. Which is all true. But, hardcore is also a movement based on friendship, camaraderie, principles, and trust. It's a musical subgenre mainly based on the experience of the live show, and not on record sales, which makes it unique. Heavily DIY-oriented, and used to function in a tough world, hardcore is an art form with true integrity if there ever has been one. Most people credit Minor Threat and Ian MacKaye with forming the die-hard mindset that gave birth to everything we now call hardcore. A heavily anti-music industry, and anti-rockstar philosophy that would persist for more than 4 decades. Hardcore was a reaction against the popsy new subgenres that sprouted from punk rock, like post-punk and new wave. The first bands that would adopt the new DIY ethics, and form the hardcore scene were Minor Threat, and Bad Brains in Washington, D.C., and Black Flag, and Circle Jerks in California. Minor Threat was created in Washington, D.C., in 1980. The band's members were vocalist Ian MacKaye, drummer Jeff Nelson, Lyle Preslar on guitar, and Brian Baker on bass. Baker would later switch to playing rhythm guitar, and the band would include a 5th member in the lineup in 1982, Steve Hansgen on bass. Together with Bad Brains and Black Flag, Minor Threat set the initial standard for early hardcore bands. Their song Straight Edge became the basis behind the philosophy of the straight edge movement, which emphasizes a lifestyle without alcohol, drugs, and promiscuous sex. The band lasted only 4 years, but its impact on hardcore punk was paramount. Their Minor Threat EP and only studio album, Out of Step, were released on MacKaye's and Nelson's own label, Discord Records. As mentioned before, MacKaye and Minor Threat were largely responsible for creating the DIY ethics within a hardcore world, and both their EP and album are considered landmarks of the genre. Minor Threat broke up in late 1983, but their legacy and impact on hardcore punk still stand. Minor Threat built the fundaments on which modern-day hardcore still stands. Black Flag was formed in 1976, in Hermosa, California, by the guitarist, main songwriter, and the only original member, Greg Ginn. Along with Minor Threat, Bad Brains, and other bands, they are considered to be one of the first and most influential hardcore bands. Their sound was unique. They mixed simple Ramones-like riffs with atonal guitar solos, and, especially in later years, frequent tempo shifts. Black Flag was, and still is, respected within the punk subculture, due to their tireless promotion of the do-it-yourself ethic. They are often regarded as one of the pioneers in the movement of underground do-it-yourself record labels that flourished among 1980s punk rock bands. Initially called Panic, the band changed their name to Black Flag in late 1978 to avoid confusion with another band of the same name. Their logo is a stylized flag made up of 4 black bars representing anarchy. The whole of LA was spray-painted with their logo. In 1981, a fan, and member of another hardcore band, State of Alert, joined Black Flag as vocalist. His name was Henry Rollins. Rollins brought a new attitude and perspective to the band. Their material became much more serious. He was intense and performing only in shorts most of the time. Black Flag started working on their first full-length album. Rollins would be the longest-lasting singer in Black Flag and would become hardcore's poster face. He is a columnist, author, actor, and comedian that keeps creating to this day. Bad Brains were created in 1977 in Washington, D.C., under the name of Mind Power. They were initially a jazz fusion band. Pretty soon they ventured into hardcore, and had some of the fastest tempos in rock music at the time. In 1980, Bad Brains released their single, Pay to Come, which is considered by many the first East Coast hardcore record. Apart from their incredible musical talent and expression, what set the Bad Brains apart was the fact that they were an all-black band. The band moved to New York in 1980, and had a huge influence on the formation of the New York City hardcore scene. In the early 1980s, a new kind of sound was emerging out of the punk rock scene in New York City, when the Bad Brains moved in from Washington, D.C. Bands like Warzone, Agnostic Front, cro-mags, Murphy's Law, and Beastie Boys, who would later become hip-hop legends, started performing. There were a number of bands that generated in New Jersey as well, like the Misfits, and Hogan's Heroes. In the early days, the scene orbited around squats and clubhouses. After the closing of these, the scene would center around a small after-hours bar called A7, and later, the legendary CBGB, where the trend of hardcore Sunday matinee shows would last until 1990, when they stopped due to violence. Pat Duncan was a radio DJ that hosted hardcore and punk bands every week on WFMU since 1979. Another one was Tim Summer, who hosted the radio show, Noise, the Show. What maybe sets the New York hardcore scene apart from the rest, is the fact that in no other place on earth could such an underground music form kick off in such a way to eventually become a worldwide phenomenon. New York was heavily struck with poverty and violence. It was a city with strong graffiti, tattoo, and gang subcultures. The hardcore scene formed quickly, gained incredible momentum, and an enormous following. It had the landmarks of a closed, elitist circle, defying modern society and much of its values, declaring them hypocritical and obsolete. By the mid-90s, New York hardcore became internationally acclaimed and exploded in popularity. Bands that started in the early 80s, and are still around today, like Sick of It All, Agnostic Front, Madball, Murphy's Law, and others, made a global impact. I distinctly remember hearing Sick of It All for the first time at my friend's house, and then venturing into the whole New York scene and beyond for years to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the room, from front to back, please make some noise! When you hear the sauce, I need you to go that way. Can you do it? Rancid! Rancid, are you ready? Rancid, are you ready? Is everybody ready? Boy, you two you got problems, man. You got some problems. Nice knowing you. Shh. Stop, 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 flash! Here we go. Stop, 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 stop. Stop, stop, stop. Stop, 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 stop. Don't waste my time. Stop.
I was really blown away by the ferocity and the message hardcore spread. It was something that clicked immediately, and I and hardcore have been very good friends ever since. There was another band from New York that gained huge popularity throughout the world in the 90s. It was Biohazard. They successfully merged elements of hardcore punk, heavy metal, and rap. They became huge with hit songs like Punishment, Tales from the Hard Side, and Shades of Grey. Although not a truly 100% hardcore act, I have to give them credit for making great music and spreading consciousness about the New York hardcore scene. During the late 90s and 2000s, a new, much more militant subculture of straight edge emerged. It was called hardline. Elgin James, a musician affiliated with the Boston straight edge militant faction, helped create the Friends Stand United organization, which had factions in Philadelphia, Chicago, Arizona, LA. The organization counted around 200 members, and was categorized as a street gang by the FBI, due to its members' frequent violent attacks on hardcore shows. Elgin James would end up in prison for extortion and gang affiliations. During the 90s, pop-punk bands like Green Day, The Offspring, and Rancid achieved international success. But they wouldn't stick to their genre, and they were responsible for also promoting hardcore. Green Day had 2 songs categorized as hardcore on their Nimrod album, Platypus, I Hate You, and Take Back. Offspring's frontman, Dexter Holland, started Nitro Records, and released several hardcore bands like AFI, Ensign, Crime in Stereo, and others. Rancid released its Rancid album in 2000, a true hardcore record. In 1994, Sick of It All released its Scratch the Surface album. This album is a true masterpiece, and, according to singer Lou Collar, it was done so heavy on purpose. The single Step Down was played on MTV for a long time.
Sing as loud as you fucking can! Step down! Let's get fucking loud! Here we go! The town had life within! Living doesn't mean a thing! When the something like vapor around the sea! And the dead is road! Let's fight this way it should be!
Since hardcore was gaining in popularity, many bands started signing for major labels. H2O signed for MCA, AFI signed with DreamWorks Records, Rise Against signed with Geffen Records.
Who is new tonight to hear Agnostic Front? We welcome you, because this is for my family!
Along came the second decade of the new millennium, and, along with many bands breaking up, the hardcore sound became much more experimental, playing with crossover and fusion. During this decade, many hardcore bands also had considerable chart recognition. Turnstile signed with Roadrunner Records in 2017, and saw their sophomore album Time and Space reach #1 on the Billboard Heatseekers chart. Gouge Away saw their record, Burnt Sugar, peak at 46 on Billboard Independent Albums. Code Orange, from Pittsburgh, saw their 2014 sophomore album I Am King, reaching number 96 on the Billboard 200, and its follow-up, 2017's Forever, peaked at number 62. From 2010 on, a number of British hardcore punk bands began forming a new musical movement dubbed the New Wave of British Hardcore. They would take influence from 80s Boston and New York hardcore bands. They were Arms Race, Violent Reaction, Big Cheese, Higher Power, Mob Rules, and many more. Partly due to developments in digital communications, there was a rise in the interaction between hardcore scenes in different places and subgenres, particularly in Europe. New festivals, events, and associations started to form, such as Flufffest in Czechia. During this time, there have been Muslim hardcore bands emerging in the US, Canada, Pakistan, and Indonesia. The reason for the development of Muslim hardcore has been traced to the impact of a 2010 film Docucore, a documentary about the Muslim hardcore scene. Some of the relevant Muslim hardcore bands include the Communists from Boston, Secret Trial 5 from Toronto, Alpha Aura, The Power from Chicago, and even a few bands out in Pakistan and Indonesia. Hardcore, during the second decade of the 21st century, saw a significant growth of the scene, and strong influences from styles generally disassociated with it, such as industrial, heavy metal, post-punk, and nu metal became evident. Around this time, mainstream rappers began to associate themselves with the hardcore scene. Denzel Curry collaborated with Bad Brains and Fucked Up in 2019. Rap groups Suicide Boys and City Morgue were joined on tour by hardcore bands Turnstile and Trash Talk, just to name a few. In early 2020, the pandemic hit, and changed the music industry, as well as most of the reality as we know it. Hardcore was no exception. Heavily based on live shows, and interaction of the bands with the audience, hardcore found itself in a completely new, unfamiliar situation. But thankfully, hardcore is a tough genre, made of tough people, and it adapted. 2020 brought a heavy digital shift in independent music, where many bands have begun performing live stream shows for fans until physical shows can occur. Social media platforms, podcasts, and people spreading the word have helped hardcore punk survive this unprecedented age of social distancing, something that is completely the opposite of the hardcore scene philosophy. The conclusion I have made, being a fan, but also trying to be objective and constructive, is that, when we take all things into consideration, hardcore is a subgenre that was hidden in the underground for many years. Seems like the very people that created the scene, and were part of it, kept it secret and protected from influences that could jeopardize its integrity. But, it's 2021, and the internet rules supreme. Social media has helped spread the message of this unconventional art form, but has also made it possible for outside influences to affect the hardcore scene. Hardcore is no more a protected shelled luxury of a small group of followers. It's growing, expanding, and changing. No one can predict in what direction it's going, nor where will it end up. For my part, I can only hope it doesn't lose the edge and intensity that make it what it is.